whatever time you happen to be watching this video. This is going to be the video that will accompany the readings for day 6. And the readings, of course, are by Nell Noddings and Kathleen Brown. And we're going to be looking at an ethical basis for school improvement. Now, we've already watched or participated in 2 presentations about ethics, about educational ethics. So this, in many senses, continues that conversation and ties it more firmly, I think, to what we've been reading about in both the Fullan article and also the first article about student voices. So, and I will warn you right now, this is probably going to be a relatively long video because there's so much content to get through. Hopefully I can keep it to under 25 minutes, but I'm not promising anything, so we'll see how this goes. All right, so how this is going to work this week in my absence is that you'll watch the video, you'll read each reading carefully, and you may want to think about watching the video beforehand to provide a context for the reading, or you may want to watch the video afterwards to kind of tie together some of the main themes for the readings. Whichever is your preference, or both for that matter, but it's going to be really important that you think through all of the main ideas, and hopefully the video will help in organizing that for you to some degree. And of course you'll have your own ideas that you'll bring to your understanding of the readings as well, which we'll take up again on the next day that I'm there. All right, so after you've done the readings, then I want you, in the forum, I'll leave more detailed directions than I normally would. So I want you to read the preamble that will be on the Course Spaces page, and it will give you some direction for responding to the question, and I'll leave a question for you to consider in light of the readings. And you'll respond based on your own learning from both the video and the readings by Brown and Noddings. So let's get going with those readings. So we're going to look first at the Nell Noddings article. Nell Noddings has been hugely influential, and you'll see her name over time pop up in a lot of different readings. She's been influential in the field of philosophy of education, in curriculum studies. She has been very influential in educational administration and leadership studies. So really she crosses the gamut of fields of study in education, academic educational studies. She's the Lee Jacks Professor of Education Emerita. That is, she's retired, but she's still very active in speaking throughout the world, really. And her career took place at Stanford University, a very highly influential university, where she had a very prominent place. She has had a prominent place in several educational organizations as well, both national and international. In trying to describe Nell Noddings, she's a philosopher, she's a feminist, she's an educationalist, and she's internationally renowned. And as I said, her name will come up in many different settings. She's primarily connected to, and although she's done other kinds of work, but she's primarily connected to this notion of the ethics of care. And the ethics of care came out of Carol Gilligan's work when she looked at Kohlberg's work that had been primarily focused on, well, in fact, entirely focused on male participants. And he had developed a whole hierarchy of moral reasoning based on that research. When she made note of the fact, and I believe she was a doctoral student of his actually, when she made note of the fact that, that there was this kind of gender disparity, she decided that her work would be focused on what would be the response of women. And when she presented cases to them that were similar to those that Kohlberg had raised, she noted a significant difference where the hierarchy that Kohlberg had developed was based on a notion of an ethic of justice. And he sees justice as the most prominent and most desirable characteristic of ethical reasoning. She, on the other hand, noticed that women most often used what she called an ethics of care, and that is relationships and caring for one another was primary in their ethical reasoning. So based on this notion of an ethics of care, Nell Noddings developed a range of, a giant body of literature, both academic readings in journals as well as many, many books, based on this ethics of care and how that might get taken up in education. And she particularly tied this to the notion of family. Now, I didn't know this until I started doing some digging around about Nell Noddings. I've known a fair amount about her academically, but I didn't know much about her personally. And what I was astounded to discover, especially given her productivity, is that she actually had 10 children, 5 biological children, 5 adopted children. And there's some if you dig around in YouTube, you'll find some interesting interviews that were done with her where she talks about that whole thing. But she based this ethics of care around what works in family, and thinking, and I guess for good reason given the size of her family. But she felt that the family in some ways embodied this notion of the ethics of care. Now she's talking about an ideal family, of course, and what that might look like if we expanded the notion of family to larger social and political domains. And so this becomes then the focus of her research. So she notes, for example, that a traditional or more modernist school improvement would be represented by this statement from her paper. Too many of us think that we can improve education merely by designing a better curriculum, finding and implementing a better form of instruction, or instituting a better form of classroom management. These things won't work. So she's saying that, in fact, the kind of traditional models that we often default to when we're thinking about how we're going to improve schools will, in fact, not change anything. It might make things a little better for some and a little worse for others. So, but it doesn't really change the forms of education in any substantive way, certainly in any way that would reflect an ethics of care. She argues instead for what she terms a kind of postmodernist school improvement. So she says that I have argued that education should be organized around themes of care rather than the traditional disciplines. So this really is a radical idea. That is, in the sense of it gets right to the root of how education is organized. And she continues by saying all students should be engaged in a general education that guides them in caring for self, intimate others, global others, plants, animals, and the environment, the human-made world, and ideas. So notice the notion of ideas not having kind of the place of privilege. Rather, she begins by talking about the notion of care for self-knowledge, those that we know and love, global others, those that we may not know, but we know of and need to develop caring attitudes towards, not in any kind of patriarchal sort of way, but rather in a reciprocal kind of way. Plants, animals, and the environment. And when I read this, as impractical as it sounds, and I have to say, as I read this, I thought, how would we do this? Which is, of course, exactly the wrong thing to begin a revolution with, but it is a startling suggestion. On the other hand, when you sit and begin to imagine what a world would look like if we actually educated kids this way, it is absolutely mind-boggling to think about what kind of difference this might make in a world that we see increasingly, because it's so, in our faces now with social media and so on, is being riven by stress and de-stress and wars and rumors of wars everywhere we look. And so it's really a a highly revolutionary idea, but such an intriguing and desirable one in so many ways. So the question then becomes, given this radical idea that she's put forward, what should we actually do? And she goes into this, of course, in her paper in more detail. So I'm just going to outline some of and talk very little bit about what she suggests. That we should have clear and unapologetic goals to produce caring, competent, loving, and lovable people. And then we shouldn't go around apologizing for the notion of care. That in fact, as she notes, as I've noted at the bottom of this slide, and as she notes in her paper, caring is the backbone of human life. Why would we apologize for that? Why would we think it's kind of mushy and silly? Why is it not central to what we do in schools? That we should take care of affiliative needs. That is, we understand students as being at the core of a circle of affiliative needs. That schools are characterized by affiliative needs. That is, we work and should work with one another. That we try to relax the impulse to control. And that as that escalates in our neoliberal world, and we are kind of limited by this whole accountability regime that is very much characterizes neoliberalism, she suggests instead that we relax the kind of control that we're putting forward, and then instead we open up opportunities for students to be at the heart of how we organize educational experiences for them and with them. That we get rid of program hierarchies, that all students should be able to participate in programs that are of interest to them, no matter whether they're going to be a mechanic or the president or the prime minister. That in fact all students benefit from a broad education, and that there should not be a privileging of one over the other. That this world needs all kinds of different gifts and talents, and the educational system should provide opportunities for and valorize all of them. That we give a part of every day to themes of care, that we teach that caring in every domain requires competence. So, and the reasoning for that is so that the recipient of care is enhanced. And that we, say it again, that caring is the backbone of human life. And this is what she focuses her very radical ideas on. Should they be radical when you think about it? Probably not, certainly not. But nevertheless, in the context in which we find ourselves, of course they really are. And yet when you think about what Fullan talks about in terms of a moral imperative, what could be more morally desirable than what she's suggesting? And even if we were to think about this and implement it in a modest way, I can't think of how it would, in fact, not enhance almost any program. So I'll be interested in your reactions to what she has to say, because, as I said, because they are so radical and they do seem so far out of the norm as far as the way things are organized today. And yet, here we are talking about something that whose ethical heart is so important to how we might think about schools and classrooms and school systems that are organized around these kinds of principles. So the areas of reform then that are required, and they're gigantic actually, would be around curriculum planning. And what she suggests under curriculum planning is really what Dewey suggested around a progressive, constructivist, student-focused kind of teaching and curriculum preparation. In terms of teacher preparation, of course, if we're going to prepare teachers for a very different environment, then we better start thinking about how we prepare them now. And I would add not only preparing teachers, but those who are already in schools, and enabling them to move forward with these kinds of initiatives. So she talks about empowering teachers in the ways that we want them to empower students. So if we were actually to teach teachers the way we want to teach and empower students, what might that look like? Well, it would, from her perspective, and probably if we had an opportunity to discuss, I imagine many of these same words would come up, that we would learn to, that as teachers, we would learn to inquire, that we would learn to seek connections between their specialty, that is, our specialized area of instruction, and other subjects. As she makes note of, when students are required to have particular kinds of knowledge in secondary school, if you're going to be in the academic stream, these are the things you need to know. If you're in the technical stream, these are the things you need to know. And yet, if you were to ask each of those areas, the teachers of each of those areas of specialization that all those students are required to know all of, they might not be able to speak with any kind of authority to any of those other areas. And she's suggesting that we should be able to speak to it, at least to the connection that it has to the area that we're responsible for in terms of our teaching subjects. That we understand the place of our subject in human life. How does what I'm teaching sit in terms of the kinds of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a human being with others, and how might that be broadly understood, and how is that enacted in the things that I do in my classroom. And she then makes a note of evaluation and rethinking evaluation as measuring. And if we think of it as measuring and not as judging, then we can think about it in a more supportive way. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the teacher is always the one doing the evaluation, but peers can do it. And this was discussed in class the other day. Peers might do some of the evaluation, and certainly self-evaluation. Am I doing the best that I can? And enabling students to look inwards in terms of how they think about the quality of the work that they're providing, rather than always looking for some kind of external marker for, yes, you're okay, you got an A, a B, or whatever it was. And so, so if we are able to do that, then that carries into what we do throughout our lives, and that can be such a tremendously important kind of a skill and value to have, that we bring to any setting that we might find ourselves in, including both the private and the public sphere. And another radical idea that she puts forward is that community caregivers, nurses, doctors, police, fire people, anyone who provides some kind of caring role in the community, cooks and cleaners and that sort of thing, they then can become involved in what is it that we want students to know, so that they can care for themselves, others, the environment, etc., etc. So these are some of the ideas that Notting puts forward. And she says when we think about whether this is a suitable vision for school improvement, she says, we must start with a vision of ourselves as wise parents. And here we get back to that notion of the ethic of care as being demonstrative of what a family might be. That we must start with a vision of ourselves as wise parents of a large heterogeneous family and ask, what do I want for all of them? So not just the kids in my family, or even the kids just on my block, or the kids in my classroom, but the kids everywhere, for each of them. Then we can commit ourselves to enacting a vision for all our children. So this is what Nottings has to contribute to an ethical vision for school improvement. Kathleen Brown, and I took this quote actually from her page, her web page, at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she's a professor of educational leadership. And at the top of her page, she has this quote from Parker Palmer. And if anyone who's a teacher, if you want an inspiring read Parker Palmer, who is a philosopher. I don't know how to describe him. He's kind of a spiritual philosopher of teaching and of education. He's a very interesting scholar and motivator. And one of the quotes from one of his books, he says, she doesn't say which one, so I'm not able to give you that, but it says at the top of her page, good teachers, and this sounds almost exactly like what Noddings is saying, good teachers join self, subject, and students in the fabric of life because they teach from an integral and undivided self. So it comes from within. They manifest in their own lives and evoke in their students a capacity for connectedness. So I just found it fascinating, this kind of serendipitous connection that I found when I was looking up something about Kathleen Brown. I'd read her work, but I don't know her personally, and I have never heard her speak at conferences. So I just found this quite fascinating. And her article, in many ways, does evoke some of what Noddings suggests. By the way, I should apologize for my voice. I've had a really bad cold that just hangs on and on and on, and it's affecting my voice today, so I apologize for being kind of croaky. Anyway, so the rationale for her paper, and she says it herself on page 80 in her paper, she said, if current and future educational leaders are to foster successful, equitable, and socially responsible learning and accountability practices for all students, then substantive changes in educational leadership preparation and professional development programs are required. Scholars, and I've added these words to replace some just to shorten the quote a little bit. Scholars in educational administration have identified social justice as a new anchor for an entire profession, servant leadership as a new metaphor, and equity for all as a new mantra. Now, someone was mentioning the other day, why are some of the readings, when we were having a discussion about something else, why are so many of the readings not absolutely current? And one of the reasons is that articles like Brown's, articles like Noddings represent a shift in thought about particular fields in particular academic fields in education. Noddings represented, as I've already made mention of, a radical shift in how we think about what we do in schools. Has it been taken up? In small ways it has, but she really provided, if we're going to think about school improvement, she really provided something absolutely different, and then she develops a rationale for it. Now, there's some rationale in that paper, but of course she develops it in greater detail in books that followed. Brown's paper was part of a special edition. It was kind of a keynote, almost a paper in a special edition on social justice in educational administration. It was published in the Educational Administration Quarterly, which is probably the preeminent journal in educational administration and leadership. It's an American journal. It has an international audience, and it's highly sought after in terms of getting your papers published in that journal. And the editor of the journal, and now I can't think of her name, but she, I may before the end of this, but she had a real interest in social justice, and she prompted the publication of a special edition on social justice and leadership. And that was the beginning of a very intense and wide-ranging conversation around the relationship between social justice and educational leadership. And I was just reading the program for the conference that I'm going to be going to, and the reason why I'm missing this class in person. And she and several of the papers that are being presented, and this is now, I think her paper was published in 2004. This is now 12 years later. And we're still talking. It's still a conversation in educational administration on leadership, and has been taken up much more enthusiastically in some cases, less so in others, in many of the departments of educational administration, or many of the programs of educational administration and leadership. So, so this is why this paper is so important. And what it does is lay out not only the rationale for the paper, but also how we might do it. Now, unfortunately, in many cases, it's particularly in the States, it's rarely been taken up because right about in 2004, sorry, right in that period, right from end of the 1990s, right to, well, right to today for that matter. But at that point, we were right at the cusp of neoliberal reforms being very tightly imposed on many organizations, particularly in the States. And so, so it became difficult to shift into something that was substantially different. But her article has been taken up as a way to think about what you might insert and why you might insert in programs that are preparing leaders for educational administration in school organizations and educational organizations, issues of social justice. So it's been instrumental in that way. So she uses a very kind of a homely metaphor for how she builds this very large case. It's a pretty lengthy paper. And she uses the metaphor of weaving. Now, I have a friend who has just taken up weaving, and it's quite fascinating. I'm a knitter myself, so so I weave things with needle and wool, but she weaves on a large loom, and she has shown pictures on Facebook and so on of the setup for these lovely pieces of work that she does. And she has these threads that she weaves across the loom, and they're the warp threads, and they're the ones that they have to be set in a very particular kind of way. They set the pattern in many ways, and they set the strength of that piece of work too, because those long pieces of wool or whatever, linen or whatever it happens to be, are really what construct that creation that comes out of the process that she engages in. The color and the pattern and the texture come from the woof threads. So she has used, Kathleen Brown has used this analogy or this metaphor for what she's developing as a kind of weaving of ideas to think about how we might in fact integrate social justice into what we do in classrooms. And I'm already at 27 minutes, so this is going to be long. At any rate, so I'll try to speed up. So she has these long threads here and these shorter threads that go back and forth here. So what are the warp or the theoretical foundations for her model? Well, the first is adult learning theory, or what some call andragogy, just as we call pedagogy for children, andragogy is for adults. And there are several ways in which adult learning theory informs how we might enable new administrators, teachers, and other adults who are parts of organizations where school improvement is the goal, how we might help them develop those skills. So there's self-directed learning, which is pretty self-explanatory, critical reflection, and this is a theme that comes up over and over again in the paper, around a critical self-knowledge that opens up an understanding of the historical and social values in which you're embedded. So how it is that you understand the world through the lens of your experience, your family values, your religious values, your cultural values, and so on. And then experiential learning, which is learning by doing. It's practical knowledge of the world. And it's really the mechanism, it's the embodied learning by which reality is constructed as in relation to critical reflection. And then there's learning to learn. So how it is that we come to know we come to know what we think we know anyway. Sorry about these typos. Reasoning, assumptions, evidence, justifications that underlie beliefs, and so on. And so these are our epistemological understandings, and those can shift depending on the context in which we have come to know something. So that can shift, for example, if I were an Aboriginal person, and there's some really interesting work that's been done around Aboriginal epistemology, or a different kind of understanding of the world. and different cultures, different groups have come to know what they think they know or what they believe that they know in very different ways. And so different bodies of knowledge, different epistemological understandings are attached to that. So learning to learn is all about understanding how it is that we come to know the world. And when we do that, then of course transformation is possible. So transformative learning is the next step. How can meaning structures acquired over a lifetime be transformed? And here again, we're talking about that centrality of experience, context, cultural understandings, and so on. The meaning structures can be shifted through critical reflection, where we externalize or we make the familiar unfamiliar and investigate the power relationships within them that we may not notice otherwise. And this can lead to transforming our perspective. And rational discourse is, after we've gone through these various steps, it becomes a means for testing the validity of the meaning making that we've been engaged in. And it becomes a bit of a loop of learning that we can revisit as our understandings of the world shift and change. And then one of the other threads, of course, is critical social theory. And she uses Freire as a great deal, who has, of course, been very, very instrumental in understanding how we can think about transforming social reality. Freire views people as subjects rather than objects who can be manipulated within systems. He views them as people as subjects who are able to change the world in which they find themselves, who have efficacy and are able to enact their understanding of the world through various mediums and means. So as they become aware of inequity, they can take action against that oppression. He advocated for an education system that in its curriculum and its pedagogy and its the ways in which people interact within it counteract ideologies of oppression, such as racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and so on. He questioned the externally imposed curriculum, a banking pedagogy where you just kind of add up information to regurgitate and get back marks, but rather a pedagogy for understanding that worked towards transformation. And he questioned the efficacy and the power relationships within hierarchical organizations. And many theorists in leadership studies, for example, have done work around how hierarchy, in fact, entrenches and makes unequal power relationships very difficult to dislodge. So as hierarchies remain, it becomes very difficult to work towards transformation. So he would suggest then that as we come to an understanding of this, then we can develop strategies for change. That all of this knowledge isn't just to fill our heads, but it's to act upon, and that will then create change. Oh, sorry. So we now are moving to the WOOF. She talks about transformative learning, and the challenge is that we do not really see through our eyes or hear through our ears, but through our beliefs, the internal courage to look within and honestly confront our biases and shortcomings. And this is necessary for the external work in the community to be authentic and effective. And this actually comes from Fullan in 1993, who mirrors in many ways what Freire is saying here. I apologize for confusing things here. What I was talking about before were other strands of the warp threads, and I think I was trying to hurry up and missed that. So now we're talking about these horizontal threads. So these WOOF threads then are awareness through critical reflection, acknowledgement through rational discourse, and action through policy praxis. So awareness through critical reflection is really the capacity building for critical inquiry and self-reflection. And that comes out of developing an awareness of ourselves and others So some of the, and this is where she actually gives practical strategies, which I found really helpful in this article. So developing a cultural autobiography, for example, sitting down as a leader and writing a story of yourself. What is your cultural autobiography? What are the influences that have caused you to be the person that you are? The good, the bad, and the ugly. And when that's out in front of you and on paper or in some kind of audio journal or whatever, then you can begin to examine it and say to yourself, what are some of the areas that I need to change if I'm going to be a transformative leader? The other suggestion she makes is an interesting one, developing life history. So going to somebody who she suggests over 65, where they don't have any connection usually at that point to organizations and so on, and really asking them to to develop their own cultural autobiography with you, so that you can understand what are the influences that have enabled that person to be the person they are, and how can you learn from that. Acknowledgement through rational discourse would be a commitment to extended and repeated conversations. I had the privilege of having this kind of discourse when I worked in a First Nations community. It wasn't that I was, I thought of it as a pedagogical strategy, but in retrospect, I understand that that's what was happening. I had an opportunity to come to know, to have conversations over time as trust relationships were built, to talk about my understanding of what I was seeing and experiencing, and getting feedback about whether in fact that was legitimate or not. And in that conversation, there was give and take so that we each understood one another better through these kinds of committed conversations. And so she gives some strategies like cross-cultural interviews, the educational plunge, which I found kind of an interesting idea. And then she suggests the last thread would be action through policy praxis. What do we mean by praxis? Well, we mean one person called it philosophy in action, theory in action, where you actually enact the things that you understand. So as you reflect on and you come to know through these kinds of activities, then you move away. You're able, because of that understanding, to move away from what she calls the technical drift. I think she's quoting somebody else, but that is where you kind of keep doing what you've always been doing, only trying to do it better. And she suggests that you have to move away from that technical drift of, developing better teaching plans or disciplining in a more worthwhile and efficacious way, etc., and rather than move to action for socially just schools and communities. And that's where social school improvement really resides, in those kinds of socially just actions. And to do that, then you need to develop action plans and act upon them. And then she quotes Freire at the end, and I think this is a good place for us to end this very lengthy video. She says, "It is true that education is not the ultimate lever," or he does, "the ultimate lever for social transformation, but without it, transformation cannot occur." And this is the challenge and the opportunity of education, that education and educational improvement, school improvement, can make a significant difference, not just in students' lives, but in the ways in which society is organized, the ways in which the environment is addressed, the ways in which we interact with one another, to get back to some of what Notting says, the ways in which we enact an ethic of care in the intimate and loving relationships that are a part of our lives, with ourselves, with others, and with the environment that we all depend on. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I apologize for the length of this video, but there was a lot of material to cover, and I'm going to try to get this under 40 minutes. And so I hope that you'll enjoy this opportunity to do some self-reflection and some self-learning, and put into action what we've been talking about. So take care. Have a wonderful week. And I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, June the 1st, beginning of a new month. Take care.